The following is a Twitter Spaces chat with Dr. SHIVA AYYADURAI shortly after the first COVID portion of the Twitter files release. Enjoy!
Their subsystems, the microbiome in your gut, the virome, the interferon system, the gut-brain axis. And none of this has been updated in the modern field of immunology. Why? Well, if you go look at Big Pharma, let's just take Pfizer, case in point. Anyone can just do a simple search. 10 years ago, they made $65 billion in revenue. In 2020, they were down to around $40 billion in revenue. They've lost $25 billion in top-line revenue. Why? Because the entire pharmaceutical system of drug development, which I'm very, very aware of since 1980, having been in the field, is based on a very medieval model. You sort of shoot out there in the dark and you find some compound and some target. Then you do in vitro lab testing. And then you kill a bunch of animals. That takes 6 years. And then if you raise funding, then you apply for your IND, FDA allowance, and then you go to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Well, if you look at pharmaceutical companies' revenue over the last 20 years, their top-line revenue, like I just gave with Pfizer, has been tanking because of this very medieval system of drug development. And the big guys in Silicon Valley and the big pharma guys keep investing in this model, knowing it's failing. And if you look at their numbers, every year they put more and more money into R&D, and less new compounds are being figured out. If it wasn't for this vaccine stuff that just took place, Pfizer would be in the dirt. And Pfizer literally in 1 year made $80 billion in revenue. That's in 2020. And in 2021 and 2022, you're looking at $100 billion. Vaccines save these companies. The scientific advisors on these companies are the same people. And you can go look at him. One of my old advisors is Bob Langer. Very nice guy, very smart guy. But go look at Bob's quote-unquote conflict of interest. Bob's everywhere. So when you look at the science, the immune system knowledge, and doctors need to get educated on the immune system. The immune system is a far more complex system. And when I gave my talk in 2019 at the NSF, the end result was that it's the right medicine for the right person at the right time. So that's the real science. There's no middle ground here. And that leads to beyond vax and anti-vax arguments. As long as we have Robert Kennedy and Del Bigtree and these guys who are not scientists, who have their own in, and I've been very, very critical of them, because they're essentially, in my views, grifters. And then you have Peter Hotze and these guys who just call anyone who raises this as anti-vaxxers. You have a serious problem. The bottom line is the immune system is a very complex system. It needs to be re-understood, but what it does lead to is the right medicine for the right person at the right time. In 2020 in January, I was one of probably the first people can go look at on Twitter. I said, this quote-unquote pandemic will lead to destruction of the economy, will lead to violation of the First Amendment, and basically violate health. That went viral. And when I did that, I got a call from the White House, a very senior economic advisor. He said, Trump is not listening to us. He's blindly following Fauci. He said, Dr. Shiva, please do videos on explaining people on the immune system. And if you look at those videos, we did them very, very quickly, but the idea was to educate people on the immune system. And one of the things we talked about, which has not been in this discourse by Peter Hotze, all these guys, is there are very powerful ways you can boost the immune system. One of the videos I did, I think got 50 million views, was on vitamin D3, telling dark-skinned people, or even white-skinned people, to go inside when vitamin D3 levels, which is, by the way, not a vitamin, it's essentially it blows up the cell walls, lyses, virus and bacteria. To tell people not even that protocol was, in my ways, completely reprehensible by any scientist. So we ran the Fire Fauci campaign because I could see this guy was, a complete scumbag, if that's the right word I can use. Now, I had to call that out. Many people in the scientific community knows Fauci has no business essentially giving a very reductionist solution. In fact, I wrote a letter to Trump. Everyone will see we made it public in March of 2020 saying, don't shut down the economy, follow personalized and precision medicine, take those people who are obviously sick and obviously are, in high-risk category, treat them very differently than everyday Americans. And in fact, we put out a protocol on this. But none of the concepts of the immune system and educating people were ever discussed. So there's not a middle ground here. There's science or there's politics. And what has occurred, as Eisenhower talked about, is that the government, the state, has used its power to impose quote-unquote science on people and create these dialectics. There is no dialectic. There is the foundations of the immune system, which leads to the right medicine for the right person at the right time. There are some very, very important aspects of the immune system that can be used to strengthen the immune system. And we have to start talking about that. So if we want to have a discourse, I think everyone on this call cares about public health. So if the discourse is about public health, that's what we need to have. And Mario, one of the things interesting is in 2019, we ran the first vaccine and immune health conference. About 1,000 people showed up. We also did a whole conference on masks, the science of it, what happens when you cover up the mouth, for particularly young kids, what it does to damage the microbiome in the mouth. And these are the discussions that we have. So I frankly have a serious problem with people saying, let's make it, Andrew Wakefield and Robert Kennedy versus Peter Hotze. It's nonsense.
Hey, Dr. Shiva, just out of curiosity, tying it back into the aspects of censorship, obviously the medical community has a lot of different thoughts. There should be disagreements and people should come to, try to make their consensus. But essentially, each of these should have been an individual patient, as you said, right patient and right treatment. It should have come down to the individual patient deciding whether or not, any particular thing was appropriate for them, interventions or treatments or so on. And it seems like the information campaign that was waged was to really push it away from individual autonomy and the right decision for individuals who either trust or don't trust a doctor or seek a second opinion, and then just create this binding consensus that everybody sort of jumped on board with, and remove that individual decision that has been sort of the foundation, I would say, of Western experience, at least for the last 100 years or so.
Well, you bring up a very good point. Look, the complexity of the immune system, when I gave that talk in 2019, said this is a reason why these decisions have to be between the healthcare provider and the doctor. And there's enough studies done, it's not the doctor telling the patient what to do. Health emerges from this discourse that takes place between the doctor and the patient. That's where health emerges. Now, when you talk about censorship, let me make a couple of points. There's a number of people out there who've been talking about Twitter files. In 2020, when I ran for United States Senate, as many of you may know, in September 25, I put out a tweet criticizing the government of Massachusetts for destroying ballot images. And the government contacted Twitter through their backroom portal, and they had me taken out. On October 30th, on a hearing, which was held in federal court, and I had to represent myself because no lawyer wanted to take this on, and on the left or the right. So I had to represent myself against 3 Harvard lawyers against the state of Massachusetts because it turned out that they had contacted Twitter. The most grossest violation of the First Amendment. What that led to, Kyle, was the following. In courtroom testimony, by the way, which Tucker Carlson, Glenn Greenwald, and ACLU were all made aware of, and they did not cover in 2020. So I have a lot of critiques about those individuals when they cover news. But what occurred in courtroom testimony was October 30th, 2020. The judge and I cross-examined the social media director of the government of Massachusetts. And she reveals in that cross-examination, which is all public in transcripts, the judge asked her, why did you decide to take Dr. Shiva off? How did you do it? She goes, we have a special partnership with Twitter, a partner support portal. And she goes, we used that to contact Twitter. And he said, why did you use that? He goes, well, we would get better. Essentially, it would go faster. I was reported a U.S. Senate candidate in the middle of my Senate campaign on Twitter, which is my platform, which I've just recently gotten back on. And the government contacted Twitter through this special portal to deplatform me. And the judge said, how did you feel after he was thrown out? She goes, we felt, quote unquote, relieved. The judge, a federal judge appointed by Reagan, Harvard Law School lawyer, trained judge, he says, I sit under the picture of Louis Brandeis. Maybe I'm old, but I still believe in the First Amendment. And so he issued a court order in a preliminary injunction hearing, a TRO, and he said, you will no longer contact Twitter until this election's over. You will furthermore not, if you have any issues with Dr. Shiva, you will engage it on Twitter. Now, I was put back on November 4th, Kyle, after the election's over. I'm tweeting away, and once again, when I share those tweets talking about the ballot image destruction, on February 1st, within 17 minutes, I'm thrown off. I go back in court on February 4th, and the hearing was set for May. On May, I discover a set of playbooks, which we also published on the site winbackfreedom.com, and we also made Tucker Carlson and others, some of them on this call, made them aware of this, and none of those guys did anything. And those playbooks reveal an actual manual created at the Harvard Belfer School. Originally, I found them on a server by Katie Minshall in London. But everyone here should be appalled because those playbooks are actual how-to manuals on how you will target a U.S. citizen. One of those targeting that you do is to determine if they're saying government officials are corrupt. Those playbooks then led to the Long Fuse report, which led us to a censorship network diagram, which has been out there for over 2.5 years. It's not just the FBI. It's not just DHS. It is an entire infrastructure. And it came out of CISA, which was signed into law by Trump. So I find it really ridiculous when I see a lot of these conservative grifters today. Oh my God, we found this stuff on Twitter files. Jesus Christ, this was out in 2020 where we were in the trenches fighting. And while these same people who raise money today talking about they are fighting for the First Amendment stayed quiet. So that same playbook, these documents, the entire censorship infrastructure, which was, by the way, funded by Pierre Omidyar, and The Intercept's Fang, if he's here, who wholesale plagiarized our stuff and never referenced our lawsuit. And it's very important to understand this because Pierre Omidyar is the founder of The Intercept, and he himself is the one who funded the Center for Internet Security to set up the clearinghouse between government and big tech companies so they could launder censorship. So that same infrastructure was used also against people who were going after Fauci or questioning him. But we need to get to a bigger discourse on who says the right things at the right time and why that's important in history. Not 2 years later acting like, oh my God, these Twitter files, this is horrible. What occurred in 2020 in our lawsuit, we put it out there. So I really, have not forget the quote unquote the left who frankly doesn't believe in the First Amendment. But my issue is with these so-called selfish anti-American grifters who, because maybe they didn't want to give attention, maybe it was going to take away their donations, didn't say anything in 2020. When we had exposed probably that lawsuit, as the judge said, he goes, this lawsuit will be taught in every constitutional law class. But most people didn't cover it, and we could have solved many things back then. Same with the vaccine issue when we really had the discourse about the immune system. So I think we need to start having integrity among the so-called people who are quote-unquote investigative journalists, and people need to look at this big conflict of interest with The Intercept, which was founded and funded by Pierre Omidyar, and also Fox News. The Murdochs are the ones who funded a part of the censorship network. And if you go to winbackfreedom.com, you'll see it. This was presented in courtroom testimony. It's all there as evidence.
Yeah, Dr. Shiva, and we talked about editorial bias the other day, and there's obviously that's the real piece is like what ideas are given light. And you see based on what ideas pop out, which ones are then able to compete for primacy in the marketplace of ideas. Tom Finn joined us, and I saw he had his hand up. I know the other two have spoken before. I was wondering if you had a response to that, Tom.
Tom, can you hear us? You're muted.
Thank you for having me, and Merry Christmas to everyone. And the doctor's right. A lot of this has been abuse in plain sight. It was quite obvious what they were doing. Obviously, it's one thing to know they're doing something. It's another thing to have internal corporate documents, again, come out confirming that the Trump White House in some way was trying to manage information. I think the release today is a little bit coy about how that took place and what censorship resulted from that. And I just hope it's not a case of, that both sides are terrible as opposed to I think the reality is that they had the Biden White House out there telling them to take people down, like my friend Andrew Bostom, who is back on, as you know from the files today. But this is really dangerous to the public health. This is not material that was taken down that was dangerous to the public health. When you tell people that they shouldn't listen to anyone other than particular government officials or corporate leaders on health issues, that's obviously dangerous to the public health. I don't think I need to explain that to the listeners here, that when Twitter becomes a medical expert, all bets are off in terms of your ability to protect yourself. And I saw early on that they got very nervous about Fauci. And, I didn't know anything more about Fauci than the average American at the beginning of the pandemic, someone had released, I think over at the Last Refuge or Conservative Treehouse, had released a file from the 2016 where Fauci was praising China and talking about how Fauci was praising Hillary and talking about how he loved her. And I just tweeted out something saying, well, oh boy, isn't this interesting? That resulted in 2 news stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think one of which tried to tie tweets like that to security issues for Fauci. So, I mean, you could actually present material on Twitter and still be oppressed and censored or defamed, which is in some ways the kind of the ugly sister of censorship as well. And January, I think it was January 8th of 2021, around the time of this whole purge related to January 6th, they took down a tweet of mine or told me I needed to take it down, otherwise I wouldn't come back on, where I said hydroxychloroquine is a safe drug. And I used to post that once a week because I knew it was accurate. I didn't tell anyone to take anything about its type to COVID. I also knew that people were unable to gain access to that, and ivermectin, excuse me, that otherwise needed it, for other reasons. And I knew the media and their allies in the public health establishment were lying about its safety and efficacy for things other than COVID. And so, someone had complained about these tweets. I was a victim of either their internal operations or, the usual suspects. And they previously, just 2 months before, found the tweet not to be in violation of their rules. But in January, they said it was. And I needed to take it down, and no appeal was going to get it back up. And I was knocked out, the head of a major national transparency group, anti-government watchdog group, for 10 months until I took the tweet down. So, this didn't end with it didn't end with Trump. There was no emergency then that required them, which I don't think is sufficient, but to the degree they had any defense, that were in a crisis in, let's say, March of 2020, and they started doing something that they probably shouldn't have done, but that's life. But this was in 2021, and so they were using COVID to target, in my view, a critic or a supporter of the rule of law on elections. So you can't separate the two. So here, though, so the headline out of this, besides our own direct involvement, as we've been hearing it before, is that the Biden White House is directly implicated in violations of law and the Constitution, targeting American citizens for censorship. I mean, they've admitted to it, but here we know that it took place. And this is, in my view, it's the tip of the iceberg. And if this doesn't result if this isn't part of an impeachment inquiry, I don't know what the purpose of those proceedings are for.
Yeah, I just want to chime in if you don't mind.
Brian, jump in, yeah, of course. And then Lisa, if you have anything to add, you and Joanna, it would be great to get your perspective on what Tom and Dr. Shiva mentioned. Go ahead, Brian.
I think that Twitter was definitely, taking steps that probably they shouldn't have taken when they banned you or suspended you, Tom. But I think it's also important to note, and I've said this before, I know a lot of people don't like this, is that there are no laws broken. There's nothing breaking the First Amendment, abridging the First Amendment, unless government is forcing a private entity to remove somebody's speech. If the government is suggesting that certain speech should be removed to a corporation, and that corporation makes a decision on their own, it would not be abridging somebody's First Amendment. And also there would be no law that's being broken.
Well, that's simply not true. It depends on the circumstances. I mean, if the government says generally, Twitter has the right to moderate content, and this content, by the way, isn't true, and if their rules allow it, and they say it generally and broadly, I would argue, and we have argued in court, so we're not just doing this, I'm not doing this just on Twitter Spaces, we're suing on this type of very activity in California where they targeted Judicial Watch and caused the YouTube video of ours to be taken down. And Twitter accounts were also being taken down. This was on election stuff. But when the government does things in such a way that you can't distinguish the operations of the government from the private corporations, or just the government ask is done in such a way as to kind of give the corporation no choice. It's kind of like a power relationship. It's like a power relationship in a harassment case. The thinking is that the person doing the quote ask is so powerful and intimidating that you have to kind of attribute this resulting action to the government official. And when you have corporations and the government colluding to violate the civil rights of American citizens and their First Amendment rights, that's a crime. Now, we can argue whether it can be proven or how successful such a charge could be against specifics, but the idea there's no laws at issue here is wildly off base.
Hey, and Brian, if you think about it, though, I'm going to give you an off.
Could I just respond to that really fast? Yeah. So Tom, I 100% agree. If there was information showing that the FBI had pressured them in a way where Twitter felt like they had to do something, or else there were going to be consequences, I think it could be argued that intimidation could be against the law. But from what we've seen thus far, we haven't seen any email saying, "Hey, we're feeling pressured by the FBI. We feel we have to do this, or else." We don't have any evidence of that right now. And it would be interesting to see what the
Brian, it's in the emails today where they're complaining about the Biden administration coming down hard on them.
But they're not saying that the Biden administration will do this if we don't do this. They're complaining that the Biden administration is asking them to do this, but they're not complaining that the Biden administration.
They were facing congressional inquiry with the government threatening to push antitrust legislation against them. What do you think that is?
Yeah, Brian. I mean, you're just giving your
so quickly, guys. Just to let you know that Dr. Lee Meng will be joining us in about 5 minutes. So I just wanted everyone to know. So Dr. Lee Meng, I don't know the full story, but I know she was censored. She was one of the early whistleblowers in China, and was heavily censored in the early days of COVID.
Yeah, you should reach out, Mario, to Andrew Boston. I don't know if he's online right now, but Andrew has just been reinstated according to the files.
Tom, if you can send me through his head. Oh yeah, I know Andrew. Yeah, he was in the files. There's a few screenshots with his name.
Yeah,
so
I'll send him a note too. So, but
Thanks,
Brian, I understand that's your opinion, but it's it's not the reality of what the legal. My understanding is, not that I'm a lawyer, but I've been fighting these sorts of battles for years. The government doesn't have to do much in order to be implicated in these situations. And, when a government agency meets with a company like Twitter, Twitter's meeting with their judge, jury, and executioner on certain regulatory issues. So you don't need, you can have this sort of mafia code that goes on in order for it to be attributed to government action. So, what you're suggesting is, well, maybe they won't be found. Well, a better position for you to take is, I don't think there's enough here for them to be found guilty of it. That's in the opinion. That's in the opinion realm. I think there's more than enough here for charges to be pursued or civil complaints to be filed beyond which has already been taken place.
I wanna go quickly to Joanna. Joanna, I want you to respond to what Dr. Shiva was mentioning earlier before I go to Viva and Harrison. Go ahead, Joanna.
I first wanted to respond to what I'm hearing here about censorship, and I think that I myself was victim to that on a different platform, on Reddit actually, back around the pandemic, and then a second time around another medically related issue that I take problem with, but I leave it to the lawyers to decipher what is illegal and what is illegal technically. But one thing that I want to bring up again that I had mentioned earlier is that amidst the pandemic and amidst disagreement with some of the quote-unquote data that was coming out when it was contested, whenever there was dissidence, people risked their medical licenses. I will cite again Peter McCullough, who was a cardiologist and documented about myocarditis and ended up losing his board certification. So looking not only to, some of these major entities that we have, honed in on, I think it's just so important to take a step back and realize the vulnerability that existed for anybody who disagreed, and whether you verbalized that online or at work, there was a real threat there. With regard to Dr. Shiva, I think there was a lot of mention about the significance of immunology. Is that what you want me to comment on?
Whatever you wanted to comment on. I'm glad you made your point, and I did bring up also Sabine. Sabine, welcome to stage. You feel free to jump in or put your hand up at any time, Sabine. I'll go to Viva. Viva, go ahead, man.
Just a quick statement or response to Brian. It's well. First of all, it's funny to actually hear the person behind the Twitter handle talking. But the amount of opinions or conclusions. It's not a First Amendment violation. Is a conclusion of law, not a premise. It's not a fact. And so, setting aside all opinions, the Twitter files have now revealed a number of things. Some of which we already knew. Zuckerberg talking about having met with the FBI. It's a serious institution. When they sit down and meet with you, you take it seriously. When you talk about the FBI now remunerating the time of Twitter employees for doing their bidding in the orders of millions and millions of dollars. You're talking about various types of government actors infiltrating or exploiting what would otherwise be private actors to do the government's bidding for them. It's not just a matter of coercion. There's bribery, there's inducement, there's a number of ways the government can turn private actors into state actors for the purposes of First Amendment violations. And just to sit there and say, I haven't seen enough, even though we've seen, weekly meetings, back channels, direct flagging, direct remuneration, to say, well, still not enough. Good, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts, and those are the facts at the current time. It's overt, it's egregious, it's in your face, it's over the top, and we're just getting one element after another of how FBI basically infiltrated and used a social media monopoly to do its bidding for itself.
No, and hey, I agree that I don't think they should have operated in the way they did. But like you said, it's the facts, and the facts don't point to a company being forced to make certain decisions. And yes, you could say, in my opinion, their pressure on Facebook or their pressure on Twitter is, in effect, making them feel forced. But that's not factual. That's an opinion as well.
Right? I mean, like you said, it doesn't have to be forcing somebody to do something through violence. You can bribe them to do something. You can offer them incentives. It's the same thing. The result is the same. That's what makes it illegal.
Well, Ian and Brian, both you guys got to realize too that there's big government contracts that are at stake that are also not in the same departments and are not being run by the same people that are making these requests. So it's always possible that someone says, hey, look, can you go look at these Twitter handles? And there is a financial discussion going on that is completely outside of that is going to be looked at by the company internally. And that's going to be, whether it's cloud computing at Amazon or Google or any of these other places, they all have the same kind of issues where they're going to look around and go, the totality of the circumstances dictates that we should make a decision to appease this particular government entity, even if that particular, group that's commenting on or that department is not explicitly threatening, the financial obligations that might be under contract or that are being negotiated. So there's a lot more at play here, and we're not seeing all of those because, first of all, we're only seeing one company. And second of all, you're not going to see financial discussions going on about whether it's reimbursement for administrative expenses, which is where you see that $3.1 million. That may be a totally legitimate amount of money, but it might be contested and they might have to fight for it, versus thinking that the government would be much more gentle about it and just send it along. So it's not a black and white issue here, and you're probably not going to see the quote unquote smoking gun with just explicit evidence from the exact department that is asking for that censorship. I think it's worth
you got to keep in mind that Amazon, has Amazon cloud services, the AWS. Google has Google Cloud, and Microsoft has the Azure system, and they're all involved in government contracts with the DoD. So it is in their best interest as companies, for the bottom line, to do whatever it is the government tells them to do. If the government says, hey, censor this, or ban these people, or hey, promote this certain narrative, they're going to do it. It's in their interest to do so, because we're talking billions of dollars in contracts. These contracts can make or break these companies. That's how big they are, right? You can't.
I think one of the I think
operate without DoD contracts.
I'm sorry.
Of course they're going to do
Well, and just quickly, one of the other issues here is the corporate corruption. Twitter was lying to shareholders and users and regulators, and I use those words carefully because when you lie in those circumstances, you raise liability for yourself. That they were doing this censorship in a good faith way that wasn't arbitrary and capricious. That's kind of my summary of how they were approaching this. And this and the other Twitter files show that's a lie. They were making it up as they go along, and they were doing it not in a good faith way, but in a way that was arbitrary and capricious and violated the terms of their own user agreements. You know, you're supposed to rely on these user agreements to kind of guide you and to protect. It protects not only corporation, but it protects the users so that their accounts aren't unknowingly taken down because they did something they didn't know about. It's clear that's what was going on here. I mean, they were working with the government to enforce these rules that that they knew the users didn't violate, and they were still punishing them. You know, if that's not civil, if there isn't civil liability arises from that, again, I'm not sure what the courts are there for.
I want to pivot to Dr. Lee Mangyan. How are you, Doctor?
Hi, thank you for the invite.
Thank you for coming on. Lucky you, I don't know the full story, so I'll be